Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link Season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Welcome to The Mything Link. Caitlin and I are so excited to share that today's episode is going to be covering Persephone and Hades, and we will be exploring their characters through one of our favorite Greek myths ever, the story of Demeter and Persephone.
So just like we've had to do for literally every other episode of this podcast, content warning, content warning, content warning. As we discuss the story of Persephone, we will be delving into themes such as rape, abduction, parental separation from a child, as well as incest. So listener discretion is strongly advised.
So to get started with in Chaos,
Persephone is played by Reiki Aola, and Hades is played by David Thewlis.
Professor Lupin himself.
Professor Lupin himself.
Which we think is great casting. Great job, Chaos casting squad. We love this depiction of Hades and Persephone, and we'll explore this dynamic and several other dynamic of Hades and Persephone in the original Greek myth. So today we're going to be using some Greek sources, mostly from the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which we will go into the specifics of that. And of course, we can't talk mythology without talking about our good friend Ovid. So we'll be using our standard Alan Mandelbaum translation for the Ovid retelling. So let's go a bit into the characters. What do you say? All right. Great.
Sounds great.
Great. So Persephone is very frequently associated with pomegranates. Pomegranates feature very heavily in her story. There are some scholars who believe that Persephone and Kore is the Greek word for maiden. Some scholars believe that these were two separate characters who then morphed into the character of who we now know as Persephone, and others see Kore as just an alternative name or description of Persephone. So we'll be exploring the idea of Persephone's maidenhood and how that changes throughout her story.
She's the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. She's the wife of Hades and the queen of the underworld / the dead. And she kind of has a double function as a vegetation and a chthonic or underworld goddess. So she has dual
purposes. And there are some stories that say that Persephone is the mother of Dionysus, that Zeus took the form of a snake and raped Persephone, and that union produced Dionysus. That's not like a super common one, and we're not really going to be discussing that in our episode today. But as we have this association with Christianity and the Christian story of creation, I think it's important to note that snakes are associated with Persephone in some stories. So we have Persephone as this maiden of springtime and queen of the underworld. And in contrast, we have Hades, who is a figure shrouded in darkness, who lives underground in the underworld. And he's oftentimes seen as like a prototype of the Christian devil or Satan. But within the context of Greek mythology, he's not typically seen as evil, and we'll explore that in our episode today as well. So last week, one of our questions that we covered in our Q&A was, what is your favorite myth and why? And both Caitlinn and I brought up the story of Demeter and Persephone as one of our favorite pieces of mythology and as the story that got me personally interested in mythology. And today, for this episode, we're going to talk about Demeter and Persephone, but we're going to focus on Hades and Persephone as a couple because that is who is portrayed in Chaos. There's no mention. Well, there's like slight reference to Persephone's mom in Chaos and the time that she spends with her, but Demeter as a character is not part of Chaos. So we'll start off by retelling the story. We gave a very brief overview of the story last episode, but there's a little more to it than that, I'd say.
A little more.
Just a little bit more.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. For this myth specifically, I have a lovely note here from our favorite doctor, Christine Downing. And she says that telling it really well would entail retelling all of Greek mythology. And
it's true.
It's so true. Like, this is just one of those central stories that includes so many side characters. We're going to tell it in such a way that we don't have to retell all of Greek mythology to understand it. But just know that if you choose to explore some of the resources that we are going to post in our show notes of what the story is and where it comes from, if Greek mythology is a gateway drug to mythology in general, this story is a gateway drug to Greek mythology. So our source text that we're using is from the Homeric hymns, and it's specifically called the Homeric Hymn to Demeter. They're named as such because they come from the time of epic poetry in which Homer lived. And Homer, of course, is who the Iliad and the Odyssey are attributed to. We don't know much about the real Homer, if he existed, how he existed, if he wrote the entirety of the Iliad and the Odyssey on his own, or if he was just perhaps a well-known poet. If there was a poet named Homer, he most certainly probably did tell these stories. And it's probably a large collection of the work of many people that we're referring to as Homeric. So I am going to give a very, very brief summary of the main points of the hymn to Demeter and leave out a lot of the extraneous mentions of different gods and goddesses. Something important to note is if you're going to go through and read this Homeric hymn to Demeter, depending on the translation you read, they're going to use different names for some of the gods and goddesses that you might not be familiar with. And they also use some coded language as well.
So you have Zeus being referred to as the ruler of many. He who receives so many is something that happens multiple times.
One with many names. My translation, they don't say Demeter, they say the Lady Mother and then the Lady Demeter. So essentially we have Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter and Zeus. Now, if you remember from the origins of Greek mythology, and if you listen to our episode on Zeus, Demeter is one of his siblings, one of the original gods of Mount Olympus. And according to the story, she only lay with Zeus one time specifically to procreate. And the result of that union was her daughter Persephone. And Demeter is very close with her daughter Persephone for all intents and purposes that we're aware of. And she trusts her to do her own thing. And one day, Persephone, like our Little Red Riding Hood, was out in a field of beautiful flowers. And the Homeric hymn names some specific flowers, the iris and the narcissus flower, which she's going to pluck. And as she does so, Hades pulls up in his chariot and plucks her instead. The specific translation I'm using says she reaches out to pluck the flower as her plaything, and instead Hades plucks her to be his plaything.
Interesting.
Yeah. So Hades plucks Persephone out of this field of flowers, and she's described as a flower-faced girl. And she cries out to her father Zeus to save her, while his brother Hades is abducting her. But her cries go unanswered. Nobody hears her. Even the trees don't hear her cries. Even the olive trees, he specifically says. So even though the olive trees and no other creature heard her cries as she cried out for her father, the Homeric hymn still tells us that Zeus approved of Hades abducting Persephone, that Persephone went against her will and was taken against her will. And there is a suggestion that Demeter hears her daughter's cry as she's snatched, but doesn't know how to contextualize it. And there's one goddess, Hecate, who overhears and knows what happens, but for some reason doesn't tell anybody about it.
She screamed in a shrill voice, calling for Zeus, her supreme and powerful father, but nobody, no one of the immortals, no one of mortal men, heard her voice any more than the olives, with their good harvest, heard her voice, except Hecate. I think it's really important to note, too, that the Greek is explicit in saying that Persephone is being taken against her will, particularly when it says that Hades grabbed her, and there's a later reference to her resisting, although he drove on. The Greek word for at least grabbed in this context is harpazo, which means to steal, thieve, carry off, snatch, seize, take by force. It is very, very clear in referencing that Persephone is an object in this scenario that is being forcefully taken by Hades to the underworld. And there isn't an English translation of the word for resisting, but the Greek word literally means against one's will. She was an unwilling participant, literally unwilling.
And there's, in the translation I'm reading, it says, so long did hope warm her dear heart, pained as she was, the mountain peaks and the ocean depths echoed with her immortal cry, and her goddess mother heard her. Sharp pain seized her heart, and she ripped apart the band around her immortal hair with her own hands, and her dark blue veil fell from her shoulders. She rushed down like a bird over the earth and sea in her fury, but no one was willing to tell her truthfully. See, I think this is referring to Demeter now. For 9 days, the goddess Demeter roamed over the earth with flaming torches in her hands, without eating or drinking. In her grief, nor did she cast the water on her skin. Wow, so here we have a depressed woman who is unable to eat, drink, or bathe. Relatable. And Hecate says, which of the sky gods or mortals has seized Persephone and afflicted your dear heart? For I heard a voice, though I couldn't see with my eyes who it was, and I always tell you the whole truth immediately. So spoke Hecate.
In one version of these myths, the first time that Demeter breaks her thirst after the 9 days that Randall's referencing of her being depressed and not eating or drinking, this kid is basically like, why are you drinking so much, so gross? And she's like, motherfucker, and turns him into a newt. It's fucking awesome. I know, me too. Like, good for her. Also, like, to hell with that kid.
So Persephone gets carried down in the chariot of Hades down to the underworld, which is, of course, Hades' realm as the god of the underworld. And once she gets there, her mom can't find her. And since nobody heard her cry, her mom doesn't know what to do. And Demeter, she's the earth mother. Her name in Roman mythology is Ceres with a C, Ceres. And that's where we get the root of our word for cereal today. So she's still associated with the grain and the harvest. And because her daughter was missing, she basically froze the earth. It was an Elsa situation where in her grief, she didn't have the spoons to allot to allowing the grass to grow, for the fruit to flower and bloom and feed people. So the earth turned into this really barren, inhospitable place. And folks came to realize that it was because she was so sad about missing her daughter that a few of them teamed together and finally figured out that Persephone had been snatched up by Hades. And so Demeter, after going on a few adventures, she descended down into the underworld to talk to Hades and to find her daughter, because of course Hades is her brother as well, right? We've got a lot of layers of incest here, unfortunately. So what happened is that when Persephone got down to the underworld, Hades was like, hey, you know, I am the king of the underworld here. I'm the brother of Zeus. If you're here, you will be queen of everything that lives and moves about, and you'll be able to spend your time in the company of immortals. And Persephone was like, you know what? That sounds pretty cool. I'd be down to be queen of the underworld. And in my translation, it says that Hades gave her stealthily the honey sweet berry of the pomegranate to eat, peering around him. And what he did was he fed her these pomegranate seeds. And in the Homeric hymn, she eats a third of what is offered to her. Then when Demeter, with the garlands in her hair, came down, Persephone told Demeter, Hades secretly, stealthily put into her hand the berry of the pomegranate, that honey sweet food, and he compelled me to eat of it. And that was how he snatched me away. He basically offered her these pomegranate seeds. And so Hades and Demeter strike up a deal that Hades will get his queen in the underworld half of the year, and the other half of the year, Persephone will be able to rejoin her mother up on Mount Olympus. And this is our pourquoi tale, our understanding, our explanation of where the seasons come from. So every springtime, Persephone emerges from the underground, just like a seed emerges from the underworld, and brings springtime with her as the flowers are blooming, because Demeter is so happy to have her daughter back that she brings the springtime for her. And then when Persephone is above the ground, it is summertime, and all the new babies are born, and the flowers are blooming, and the fruit is fresh off the vine. And then autumn comes when Demeter is getting ready to lose her daughter again, and she starts becoming sad and upset. And that is when all the leaves start falling off the trees, the flowers start dying, and Persephone descends back into the depths of the underworld, just like the seeds that go underground in the autumn to then bloom again in the springtime. And so it's a beautiful, loving, moving story about a mother's love and about how hard it is for Demeter to dedicate her time and energy to anything else when she's missing her daughter. And so it's a period of hibernation for the gods, for the earth, for Persephone descending into the depths of the underworld.
So I think this is a good place to interject that there are multiple written forms of the Demeter and Persephone myth. In some versions, this whole story of Hades abducting Persephone and taking her to the underworld is instigated by Aphrodite. So in one version of this myth, you have Persephone, who is the love and light of Demeter's life, and she's doing what she loves to do, which is frolicking in the sunshine with her friends, collecting wildflowers in her basket and laughing. And you have Aphrodite saying, I have struck Zeus with erotic love. I have struck Poseidon with erotic love. Why the hell am I not striking Hades with erotic love? And so she says to her son Cupid, like, you better shoot that arrow at Hades. So Cupid shoots Hades in the heart with the arrow, and Hades goes to Zeus and asks for his permission to marry Persephone. And Zeus says, I would love this. I think this is a great match, and I would gladly give you my daughter. However, Demeter would never agree to this, and since I can't force Persephone, I will help you secretly seize Persephone. I will help you secretly abduct her and make her your wife. And so they basically make a really appealing flower grow from the ground that Persephone wanders away from her friends to pick. And as she reaches down to pick the flower, the earth cracks open. And this is an interesting aside because the underworld is typically in these mythologies seen as being below the earth. It's not like a transcendental place somewhere else. So Hades cracks open the ground and grabs Persephone and takes her back to the underworld, and she's crying out for her mother and father, and nobody even notices what's happened. All they notice is that her basket of flowers has been dropped on the ground. Also in this Greek form of the story, Demeter, the great goddess, she wanders the earth in this depressed state looking for her daughter, and she's like asking people what's happened to Persephone, and we find out that she is basically so angry that it's not that her depression causes the barrenness of the land. It is an act of vengeance that she causes humans to starve. Because in starving the humans, the gods are denied their sacrifices and gifts. So it's very intentional on her part because none of the gods are helping her get Persephone back. So she goes, okay, well, fuck you guys. Then I'm going to inadvertently take this away from you in the best way I know how, which is as the grain god, she's going to say, no more grain. No more grain.
That's really interesting. I like that intentionality of it, but also it makes me feel like it's still very male coded.
It's interesting because in this version, each individual Olympian addresses Demeter and says, "Great goddess, please bring the grain and the life back to the ground." And she says, "No, tell Hades to let Persephone go, and I will." And Zeus is like, "I love our daughter too, but like, it's done." You know, like he's being a dickhole about it, of course.
Well, shocking. Zeus
I know,
is being
weird.
a dick.
I know, it's so weird.
Ugh.
So basically, then Hermes goes down to Hades and is like, "Please let Persephone go." And Hades is like, "Of course I will let Persephone go. I love her." And he says to her, like, "Go, but just know that I would be a kind husband to you. Like, I truly love you and I really want you by my side, but go ahead." However, in the same breath, he like hands her these pomegranate seeds, which are ultimately her downfall and the reason that she's required to stay in the underworld. So she gets up to the surface and Demeter's like, "Did you eat anything?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I just took these pomegranate seeds from Hades just now."
And in the Homeric version, she acknowledges that Hades tricked her into eating the pomegranate, that she ate the pomegranate seed against her will. It wasn't like a spread was put out in front of her and she's like, "Ooh, let me taste a little bit of this." It was very intentional on Hades' part because he knew that that would keep her down there.
He says, "I love you, go, but also have some food for the journey."
Yeah.
Like in this version, he's like really sly and caring about it, you know, like gross. Demeter's very happy to have Persephone back, but Persephone can't be back all the time, all the way.
And in the Homeric version, Persephone stays underground with Hades for only a third of the year and is back up on ground for 2/3 of the year. And in other versions, it's 6 months and 6 months. And so whatever it is, like in some versions, she eats 6 pomegranate seeds, and that's why she has to stay below for 6 months. In other versions, like the Homeric hymn, if you just eat any food of the underworld, then you have to spend a third of the year down there with Hades. That was just the deal that was struck. But in pretty much every version of the story, Persephone doesn't have her own autonomy. She doesn't get to use her own voice to make her own decision about what she wants to do, right? It's these other people negotiating above her head. I'm going to go into a little bit of my personal connection to this story. This is specifically for you, Dr. Downing. I found a new connection to this myth for me personally just this past week in telling the story to somebody else. And I was just telling it as like a charming anecdote of where the seasons come from. And isn't that fun? And I realized that I am Demeter in this story, striking deals of custody with my co-parent to have access to my daughter. And every time she leaves for a chunk of time and I don't get to speak with her or see her, I definitely descend into a version of not watering any of my plants, not allowing anything to grow. And I feel like I'm really putting my own personal feelings and opinions and thoughts into Demeter's reaction, like as a mother who goes through this cyclical version of losing access to my daughter over and over and over again. And half the time when that happens, I feel capable of doing almost nothing else but becoming a seed and getting lost in a nest of blankets on the couch and not allowing anything to flower and grow because of the pain that it causes me and the depths of that separation from my child that I don't have any control over. And of course, this tale is not about co-parents and their child, right? It's about a grown daughter leaving home to move in with her husband and the pain that her mother feels. But that's the archetype. I can connect with Demeter as a mother and understand that specific pain of losing my child in cycles over and over, even though I know she's coming back to me. It's a different loss every single time she leaves. And call me crazy, but I had never connected my story to this story in that exact same way. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to re-dive into it. And I'm connecting to it personally in a way I never would have thought before. And that's why I'm so frustrated that like Demeter's motives for not letting anything grow are shown through this lens of the patriarchy, that it's just wrath or anger or getting back at the other gods. Like sometimes what that depression looks like, what that separation looks like, is that I'm out of spoons. I'm not capable of dedicating my time or my energy towards anything else when I'm in the midst of that grief. And I think it's perfectly reasonable that Demeter hangs up her hat and takes work off while Persephone is gone. And I wish in our capitalistic society I had the luxury of doing the same. It's really important to note that in mythology, a journey to the underworld can often be seen as a mythological retelling of a coming of age story, right? Of having to go through a trial that is uncomfortable and unknown and scary, and go through this and come out the other side a changed person. It's the journey of puberty, feeling uncomfortable in your own body and not recognizing yourself and not knowing who you are, and having to take all of these pieces and put them together in a new and different way out on the other side. And we see this in Persephone's journey as well.
I think it's really important to note here that Hades is the god of the underworld, right? He's the ruler of the dead, but he is not the god of death. There's a very clear distinction between Hades and the actual god of death. The god of death was named Thanatos. We talked a little bit about him in the Sisyphus story. So in that sense, Hades was, I even want to say, arguably a neutral figure in a lot of ways. Like, he embodies the finality of death. He's very stern, but he's also very just. He wasn't particularly kind, but he was very concerned with maintaining the natural order of life and death, which I think we get a lot of in the Demeter Persephone story. You know, you see the life, death, rebirth, the natural cycle of things. So, like, in ensuring that the dead stay dead and have a place to go and are put in their proper positions, his rulership ensures that death is a natural part of life that doesn't overshadow the lived experience, but also is something to be honored, and it's part of the cosmic equilibrium, if you will.
And I think that's a really good point. The Hades of Greek mythology, he is darkness, but he's not evil in the same way that the Christian idea of Satan is. And I think that's a really important distinction, because so frequently when we compare mythological traditions, we tend to see them in a structure or in a framework as the tradition that we were raised in. And like Caitlinn and I have talked about, we were both raised in Christian, the umbrella of Christian communities with Christian value system. And of course, if you open your copy, if you've got a copy of the Christian Bible, you're not going to find any descriptions of Satan as a horned beast. Most of our ideas of who Satan is and the evilness and these pieces of his personality, they come to us from Dante's Divine Comedy. John Milton's Paradise Lost. Both of those things are true. And most of the ideas of hell that we get are like coming from Dante, who, the one who suggested that there's a purgatory and that there are different layers of hell with different punishments depending on your crime. And that's some biblical fan fiction. And, you know, we love a fanfic over here.
We do. And we especially love when the Bible fanfics.
When the Bible fanfic is like it's basically canon now, right?
I know, which is so interesting. Like, you know, our ideas of hell are very loosely based off of Greek myth thrown together with some like sprinkling of Zoroastrianism and like put into like Dante's Inferno. Gehenna, the word for hell, if you will, in the New Testament, was a literal physical trash pit outside of the city of Jerusalem. Like, it was an actual tangible place.
Like a place where you will be banished to outside of community and outside of like resources.
Something that I think is interesting about how actual Greek people related to Hades was, you know, we talked about how in Chaos, Orpheus takes the coin out of Eurydice's mouth, which ultimately, in Greek mythology, you need that coin to pay Charon to ferry you across the river Styx and get into the underworld, else you're, you know, left to wander. Okay. So basically, like, the Greeks honored Hades through rituals and at funerals and through funerary rites, but generally it was like a Voldemort situation. Like, you didn't name him. You only referenced him and not by name because you didn't want to attract his attention. You didn't want to have him pay premature attention to you.
Right. You didn't want to make yourself into a target.
Right, exactly.
Because if he noticed you, then maybe he'd discuss with the fates and be like, oh, hey, what's Randall's deal?
Caitlinn was just brought to my attention. Should we do something about that?
Yeah.
Right. The unseen one was the words that they used because Hades, he got a helmet of invisibility from the fucking Cyclops during
the Cyclops.
The Cyclops during the Titanomachy. I found Chaos' portrayal of Persephone incredibly fascinating. One, because I loved that they picked a beautiful woman of color to be Persephone.
Yes,
right?
Rachiaola was an incredible Persephone, and she had such a power and a strength, especially in contrast with David Thewlis.
All I remember him is as that
Remus.
creepy crab guy in the Dinotopia show. I do not think of him as Remus. I think of him as
he's Remus. He's Remus Lupin. Did you know that?
Yes, yeah.
Like he seems like a man of slight build who's thoughtful and considered in his words and his actions, and he plays Hades in that way.
And very concerned with balance. Like his character in Chaos is very concerned with the cosmic equilibrium.
And this perspective comes to us from a lot of these stories as well. Like Caitlinn was saying, pretty much the one bad story we have of Hades is that he kidnapped Persephone. Like, that's it. But then we look at someone like Zeus, who's the king of the gods, and he's kidnapping and raping and murdering people all the time. And Poseidon is doing that as well, right? Like Poseidon's the one who raped Medusa, like we talked about a couple weeks ago. So for as bad and terrible as the masculine figures in Greek mythology are, Hades is like pretty damn near spotless in comparison. And
you could also argue that it wasn't even his autonomy to abduct Persephone, right? Like,
yeah, like it was motivated by Zeus or Aphrodite, depending on
Aphrodite was greedy and wanted to assert her power over Hades, and so she didn't give him a choice.
And what Chaos did was it took out that rapey element and it let Hades be a good guy. The storytelling allowed Hades to be a good guy and to share this passionate love relationship with Persephone, where there was an equal balance of power. And Persephone makes a comment about it that the story of her abduction was like bad PR from Hera, that Hera was just trying to like devalue their relationship because of whatever jealous reason, which I love. That's a Hera being a Hera, right?
Hera being a
like,
Hera. Yeah.
She would be angry if her sibling found love in an appropriate, joyful manner when all she's known from her siblings, right? Because Hera and Zeus and Poseidon and Hades and Demeter, they're all siblings. And for Hera to see Hades treating her niece so much better than she could ever be treated by Zeus, like that makes sense to me that she would want to spoil that relationship or make it lose credibility or whatever it is, so she could remain, because she's the god of Olympus and Hera is one of those gals who there can only be one queen at the top. And like, yeah, Hera, you're the queen at the top and she's the queen of the underworld, and like both of those things are true. And as much as I think it's like really important to talk about Persephone's lack of autonomy and all of that in these stories, I really liked this read on the tale that Persephone is pissed that Hera is spreading this story around the mortals. And she's like, oh, that shit again? Like Hades and I love each other and I do have autonomy. And like, this is not that. And I thought there was power in that too.
I mean, that's the beauty of mythology here, right? You can have both of these stories at the same time, and they should exist at the same time. We shouldn't pick one over the other, right? Like, I love this retelling of the myth, you know?
And in Chaos, Persephone is allergic to pomegranates, and she's like, oh, pomegranates again. Like, you like just the whole story is just made up to piss her off by Hera, and that is just such a fun read. And Persephone mentions in Chaos, oh, Orpheus, I know that guy. He's got great songs. I heard his last album when I was up visiting my mom last. So they very like slyly drop that into there, which is fun because if you have the knowledge of Greek mythology, then you're able to catch it.
The mention of Hera made me think of one of my favorite Hades stories, which is Heracles. The story of Heracles briefly goes that Hera hates Heracles because he's a son of Zeus. He's a demigod. And so she strikes him with madness and he kills his whole family. And so to atone for this terrible thing that he's done, he needs to perform 12 labors for a king, one of his cousins. His 12th labor is to capture Cerberus, Hades' three-headed dog, the guardian of the entrance to the underworld. 12th, in my mind, means this is the culminating hardest labor that he's going to experience, right? It's the final task before the
big boss.
The big boss, yeah, exactly. And what does he do? Hercules walks up to Hades in the underworld and goes, "Can I borrow Cerberus?" And Hades goes, "Sure, just don't hurt him. Like, bring him back." It's fucking amazing. Hades isn't like, "You have to sell your soul to me," or like whatever. He's just like, "Sure, don't hurt Spot." It's fucking awesome.
Ah, I love that. And I also love the lesson in that, right? Like, something could seem like an impossible task, but like the answer is always no if you don't ask the question.
Yeah. Also, I thought it was interesting too that in Chaos, she has her own side hustle. She's helping Eurydice get back to the surface, you know, alongside of Medusa. She has the autonomy and the power and the space to do that.
And she very clearly has Hades' ear and influence over Hades to make those decisions and to tell him like, no, this is what needs to happen, or to go above his head or behind his back, right, in order to make those things happen.
You actively see them communicating in Chaos, right? I'm thinking of a scene where he's like on the phone and she's like over his shoulder at the desk, like, tell him this, tell him this.
Yeah, it's very, very much that concept that we've brought up a couple times this season. The man may be the head, but the woman is the neck who turns the head. And we really, really see this with Chaos's depiction of Persephone and Hades. I love it.
You know, I think I have a lot of beef with feminist interpretations of this story, which is weird hearing me say that, right?
Yeah.
I always am wanting to have.
I feel like I know what you're going to say, though, because I have a similar feeling. So go for it.
Okay, so like, this is a story generally about women's powerlessness in Greco-Roman society, which at the end of the day, we can rewrite and retell this myth however we fucking want to relate to it, but we cannot just decide that the original myth means something else in this context, because it doesn't. There's no way around the fact that Persephone is a young, innocent girl who is taken by force by an older man who she cannot say no to and isn't even given the opportunity to say no to. To be clear, she is just finds herself crashing into the underworld, right? And we can see it as a story about like women's creativity and power and resilience, because you have Demeter, whose heartache is so great that barrenness racks the face of the earth, or like the nymphs who try to help Demeter and Persephone by standing up to Hades for his violation of Persephone, or, you know, Aphrodite, who is like desires and actions sent this whole story into motion, right? Like, you can weave it in that way where it's like, sure, women are like still powerful in their own right, but at the end of the day, Persephone has no agency. Homer and Ovid both explicitly use language that describe what happens to Persephone as non-consensual. Even her return to the upper world is facilitated by other gods, and she is only allowed to come up at certain times of the year. So even in that like half-assed freedom, she's still bound to this structure that's been decided for her by other people.
Right. Like, so many of us are stuck within the confines of patriarchal systems of oppression, of systems that we don't have autonomy over. We don't have the decision making.
And I guess what I'm referencing in particular, Lore Olympus, where Persephone is like falling in love with this hottie with a body,
tall,
Hades.
dark, and handsome.
Yeah, and they're like, this is a willing love story that's just got like framed wrong. No, Persephone is a rape victim. She is a tragic victim of an assault. And at the same time, she is a fucking badass of the underworld. Like, she fully reigns as queen of the underworld. You know, she shares Hades' responsibilities. People refer to her as the dreaded Persephone, and you know, Odysseus in the Odyssey, he sacrifices a ram to her. Like, she's very much an active participant in equally ruling the underworld alongside of Hades. But it's important that we not erase the sexual violence from this tale, is what I'm getting at. So you can say that Persephone grows into being the badass of the underworld, but at the end of the day, I really feel uncomfortable with retellings of this story that portray their relationship as some sort of misconstrued love story, because it's not. Maybe they grow to love each other, but that's more reminiscent of Stockholm Syndrome.
Of Stockholm Syndrome, or arranged marriage, you could also compare it to. But yeah, I 100% agree with you.
Stockholm syndrome is where victims of a uneven power imbalance develop some sort of emotional bond or psychological connection with their captor or abuser. So oftentimes this is a stress response. Oftentimes it's self-preservation. You form an emotional, intimate connection with somebody you spend a lot of emotional, intimate time with, and you
grow to love your captor. It's the classic examples, Beauty and the Beast, right? Where she's kidnapped, she's stuck in the dungeon, and then the beast starts to show Belle kindness. And when she has the opportunity to leave, she chooses to come back because she's been like institutionalized, essentially. And like Caitlinn's saying, it's a psychological, like, it's an adaptation that we have as humans because we don't want to see ourselves as victims or captives or whatever that looks like, because if we do, that could break us.
There's a Criminal Minds episode where it's about a sex trafficking ring, basically, and this guy, he abducts this young girl and he grooms her to be his accomplice as an adult in abducting more young girls. And she's eventually given freedom, quote unquote, because he's groomed her so aggressively and so strongly that she has become identified with him instead of with herself or the young girls that she's abducting. That's like a really like keen example in my mind. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because I was thinking like Persephone, in my opinion, could be a really strong example of Stockholm syndrome in that sense, right? Like you see her sharing power in the underworld and ruling the underworld with Hades, and he doesn't appear to be over controlling of her. She has some sort of autonomy. Typically they're seen as monogamous and at least like having some sort of stable relationship.
Right. And Persephone's able to move between realms, but just like we already said, it's not freedom of movement, right? It's a pre-planned cyclical, it's a seasonal migration that's dictated by external forces and not by her own autonomy.
People see her as not having Stockholm syndrome because she chooses to leave Hades' side to go back to her mother. My argument is exactly what Randall just said. She doesn't really have a choice. She's been manipulated into eating the fruit of the underworld. She's been maybe manipulated into thinking what power and love are in this context. And so I find myself wondering if she really, I want her to have power and be this badass queen of the underworld, but I also wonder like if there's some patriarchal performance in that, for sure.
But she's also like a woman who's making the best of the situation that she's been dealt, right? Which is really inspiring for a lot of us who are perhaps trapped in situations that we never thought we would be participants in. And how do you make the most of it? Since we're talking about Persephone, I want to make sure we talk a little bit about the pomegranate and the symbolic power of the pomegranate. The pomegranate played a part in the Eleusinian mysteries, don't you know? Honoring Persephone and Demeter as the feminine source and continuity of life. And in some of these rites, the initiate was only allowed to eat pomegranate seeds. And in other versions of the rites, pomegranate seeds were forbidden. So we've got a lot going on about here. And in a psychological sense, the eating of the pomegranate was associated with the descent into the unconscious. In this myth of Persephone, we have this idea of, if we look at the story of Persephone from an archetypal perspective, where it's a psychological journey of a person, we see a young maiden who is in the throes of her maidenhood, and all she wants to do is pick pretty flowers in a field. And that's like the limited scope of her view of the world and her understanding of the world. And she is forced against her will to confront the depths of her unconscious, right? Hades represents that force of being snatched out of maidenhood and pulled down into the deep depths of your own soul and forced to confront the darkness that we all have within us.
How would you define unconscious?
Oh, God, that's a really good question. I mostly relate the unconscious to the shadow self, and I really resonate with Robert Bly has a great explanation in one of his articles about what the shadow is, and he describes it as the long black bag we drag behind us. And that's my favorite imagery of the shadow. And Dr. Downing, yes, please come at me. I know you do not like Robert Bly. What I'm referring to comes from this book, Meeting the Shadow, The Hidden Power of the Dark Side of Human Nature. So what I really love about Robert Bly in this article, The Long Bag We Drag Behind Us, is he envisions the shadow self as this bag that we carry with us throughout our whole lives. And every time our behavior is corrected or we're told that something doesn't fit or that something is wrong, we put it into this bag and we stop dealing with it and we stop acknowledging it as part of us, but we're still carrying it with us the entire time. And throughout my life, in the 10 plus years since I've read this article by Bly, I have really like latched on to this idea of specifically like a garbage bag. I feel like our shadows are garbage bags that we're carrying with us, and everything we throw in there just layers on top of the things that we threw in there before. And one day these bags are going to start to stink. And if we've never turned around and gone through what we've been holding on to in that bag, we're not going to know where the source of the stink is coming from, right? We're not going to know where the rot is happening. And this is, I think, a lot of the issue with complex trauma survivors who are suffering from complex post-traumatic stress. There are so many things in that bag that are rotting, and we don't know when we threw them in there. We don't know why they're in there. We don't even know how to go about recognizing them, because the moment we open the bag, we're just hit with that foul stench. And it takes so much work to dig through that. And I think that's what's so powerful about the unconscious, and like meeting your shadow and confronting the unconscious. And the power that Persephone's story holds is that she's dragged into this meeting with her shadow kicking and screaming, because what's the opposite of a young girl who loves to be out in the sunshine and collect flowers? An old man who's stuck in the depths of Hades, who can never see the sunshine. There's such opposites, and Persephone is challenged to confront these parts of herself and take her place as the queen of the underworld, and show how you can be both the maiden who picks flowers in the summertime and the queen of the underworld in the wintertime, asserting your power and asserting your dominance over a male-dominated realm. And there's so much power in that to me. And yes, we can interpret her story as a rape, as a Stockholm syndrome, as a victim. Absolutely, we can and we should interpret her story that way. And also, we can see this as a young girl who's forced to confront the worst, most evil parts of herself and accept them and embrace them and reemerge into the earth after having spent that time underground, nourishing the things that would previously be seen as dark or negative or bad, and find that beauty within the darkness. And that is so powerful to me. And by Persephone embracing the darkness in herself and allowing herself to become queen of the underworld for part of every year, she's living in a state of recognition with her shadow self. And that's something that we should all hope to accomplish for ourselves, right? This is part of growing up, accepting that we have darkness and limitations, and perhaps our participation is going to be cyclical in things, right? And we need to learn how to compromise and embrace our shadow selves. And Persephone is an example of this harmony between the self above ground and the shadow self in the underworld. And I think it's so powerful to see that darkness isn't necessarily evil. And this goes back, like we talked about in our Dionysus episode, about like the tension of the Dionysian and the Apollonian, and Persephone is a figure who exists in these tension of opposites alone and shows the power in that. And like the idea that the underworld existed for Persephone's entire life as just below the surface and just below her feet, and she was either unwilling or unable to look down and confront that darkness until she was forced into that realm. Like, we all face that kind of like kicking and screaming, essentially, when we're forced to confront these pieces of ourselves. Like Caitlinn and I have talked about, we've both been in situations, in relationships, in times where we are Hera, and we could either throw that into that black bag we're dragging behind us and wait for it to stank and putrefy as we grow older, or we can confront that and say, I was behaving as a hero. I take accountability, and how can I be better moving forward? And I think that so much of that confrontation and acceptance of the shadow self is realizing, yes, I get angry, I get frustrated, I get overstimulated, and I'm bad at communicating. And those things are all true. And it doesn't mean I love the people around me any less, but it does mean that I need to acknowledge and apologize when those pieces of me come out to play, instead of pretending that they don't exist. And I think in our modern culture, we're taught to pretend that these things don't exist instead of embracing them fully. By ignoring our darkness, just like a clogged garbage disposal that we put off fixing, eventually the muck will come shooting out towards us, no longer able to be ignored or contained. That's a direct quote by Randall Ulyate.
One of my favorite scholars, by the way. Y'all should check out her published work.
Right. It's a difficult journey for everybody. And Persephone didn't just acknowledge that her shadow was there, but she took dominion over it, right? And we see this whole life cycle, this journey of Persephone, where she begins as a child, as a maiden who's naive and innocent and full of wonder. And she's plunged into this realm of the shadow, and none of us can ever emerge unscathed. And she took this massive shit sandwich and fashioned a beautiful life for herself. And yeah, depending on my mood and depending on the day, like, I have so many different interpretations of this myth. Am I Persephone confronting my shadow self and being queen of the underworld? Am I Demeter, lost in the throes of depression and frustration and anger at those around me every time I lose access to my child? Am I Hades, stuck in a place that perhaps I didn't pick, doing a job that I don't necessarily love and just want some love and companionship alongside me? Like, that's mythology. We are all of these characters at different times. And this myth, again, is one that just continues to grow and morph for me. And I'm so grateful to have encountered it at such a young age. I know we don't love to discuss Jung a lot on our podcast, but he does have a nice quote that I'd like to put in here. He says that he would rather be whole than good. And I think that that's something that Persephone really embodies, right? And allowing and forcing ourselves to acknowledge our shadow self. And part of what Christianity does is it tells us that we should strive to be perfect, pious beings who don't have these shadow selves. And I think that's some of the issue of our modern condition and culture, from my point of view, is that we need to accept the darkness in our shadow selves. And like, that's what I love about Greek mythology. Hades is the lord of the underworld, and he is darkness, but he's not the thing you need to be afraid of in the darkness in the same way that Satan is. Like Lucifer is a fallen angel, and his falling in Christianity was a direct result of him thinking that he could have his own autonomy and opinions and voice, when God is the one who should be in charge. And Hades, on the other hand, like, he's not an evil being. He is darkness without being evil. And the real monsters we need to fear, the monsters like Zeus, who feel comfortable standing in the full light of day and exposing themselves for the monstrous being that they are without feeling the need to hide in the shadows. And so Hades isn't hiding in the underworld because he's evil and banished and not acceptable. He is part of the wholeness of the human experience that encompasses life and death. And I think that that's really beautiful.
Something that I think Randall hit the nail on the head that's really detrimental about particularly the Western American evangelical tradition is that you are not allowed to be human. You are not allowed to have a shadow self. If you do, you are to hide it. If you do, it is something wrong with you. You are not allowed to have a sexuality. If you do, you are to squelch it, right? Like there's no acceptance of embodiment, in my opinion, in the evangelical tradition as it stands now. And so I feel like a lot of my life, I, hid Or like I tried to shove all of the things that I felt like the Bible and the church were telling me was wrong with me. I tried to shove them down into that chasm that separates humans from God, that no matter how hard you strive, you cannot possibly bridge that expanse because you're too far away from the divine. Like the only word I can think, and I say this phrase like anytime somebody asks me about this, the only phrase I can think of is striving. There's a particular vision of hell, literally a vision of hell in, I forget what exactly the specific tradition is, but you're basically hanging in a dark abyss and you can see the light, and all you can do is stretch out for that light and you will never get there. And you are stretching and stretching and contorting yourself and trying to reach to the point where you're like harming your own body, but you can never reach that light. And that is exactly what I mean when I say striving. I felt like in order to possibly even continue to strive across that chasm between me and God, I had to put all the parts of my embodied existence away. Just not.
Well, you're not supposed to be in this world.
No.
Or you're not supposed to be of this world. You're just supposed to be in this world.
And you
right?
know, like,
and like
the flesh is evil is a really prominent message, particularly of evangelical purity culture. The flesh is weak. You know, you are not supposed to identify with your humanity in any way, shape, or form. And so, like, you know, I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD or CPTSD or bipolar disorder until I was in my late 20s, because I literally had spent so long just pushing all these things back, pushing all the parts of myself back that I didn't, not even that I didn't like, but that I didn't think were okay. And so I grew to not like them. I threw them over my shoulder in this bag that smelled. But like hearing the story of Persephone, she became queen of the underworld. I think, Randall, the sentence, she took this shit sandwich and made a beautiful life out of it. Like, ooh, it's literally
you put me on that.
I am, and I'm like gonna cry, which is like sums up who I am as a human being. But like, you know, she was the maiden who loved being in the sun and being carefree, and like you have to like believe that that's the life that she wanted in that moment, and she's forced to take all the parts of herself that she doesn't like and make them her strength. And that's like how I have begun to see myself, like why I identify so strongly with Persephone is because she was this, you know, carefree maiden who had that taken violently from her, and she made the
like
fucking
so many of
best
us
of us. So many of us have the same experience of you are denied that carefree, like lack of responsibility, that appropriate flower collecting era of life, and forced violently into this patriarchal world. Not to say that the underworld is a patriarchal world, but in a lot of senses, like you're forced to confront the darkness. And our society tells us that the darkness is bad, but the reality is the darkness is. And you can make it bad and torture yourself and punish yourself for things you were never meant to punish yourself for, or you can be like Persephone and be like, I am both. I am maiden, mother, and crone, like Randall said before. I am all three at once and never any of them at the same time, right? Like I am all of these characters. I am life and death and rebirth all at the same time. It is the beauty of mythology, is the beauty of the chaos.
It is. And I think that like you said, Caitlin, the darkness is, it is just like death is, right? We can't control it. We can't fight against it. That all of these ideas of fate and the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, like, and the story of Hades and Persephone, they all teach us these things. And for me, part of what is so powerful that I get out of that is when we're confronted with the darkness, we can either sit there huddled against the wall in fear of what might be there, or we could stand up and turn on a light and explore it, right? Like, and it's similar to this Buddhist idea of inviting your demons in. When you meet your demons, inviting them in for tea and cakes and conversation, and ask them what they need to feel better, and hug them and release them, right? We can't fight against them. And so there's all of these ideas about that. Also, what you were talking about, like Christianity, Bly addresses this in his article as well, that Christianity encourages us to put our sexuality in this bag as well. And so much of deconstructing being raised in these traditions is allowing ourselves to shake free of this idea of shame around these pieces that we've been told belong in this bag and don't belong out in the light of day. And that's been a really healing experience for me, to like the journey of unmasking and realizing that all these things I was told are too weird and unusual about me are actually like the things I love the most about myself, and the things I think I bring to the table that are really special and unique and valuable.
What if thinking about, Christianity and sexuality, which is like what I think about, 95% of the time. What if like Persephone's really into BDSM and like Hades agrees to be like her daddy, and she isn't non-consensually violently abducted, but like she's real into this shit, What if?
I think that's a fair read. For sure.
She doesn't want to be like, hey mom, gonna go get bound up in the underworld, see you later.
Right. And there's absolutely some truth in that because as humans, we are not fully honest with our parents about who we are and what we want, right? Yeah. And there's some interpretations of the story that posit that maybe Persephone wanted to go with Hades and wasn't able to expose that part of herself to her mom because it didn't fit.
When you're a young human being, I imagine bringing home an older partner doesn't go over super well with...
Especially if they're your mom's brother.
If they're your
your mom and your dad's brother.
Especially if they're like 3 times your age.
At least.
Also, did you know that according to Hesiod's Theogony, Cerberus has 50 heads and not 3?
Excuse me? I knew nothing of this.
Right? It's kind of uncomfortable. Also, how would you even fit? Like, how would it not fall over? Like the dog, if it had 50 heads, why wouldn't it just be like...
It's a magical dog of the underworld.
But would be in the air.
A little top heavy. For sure. So throughout most of our conversation so far, we've been using Greek sources, like we mentioned with the Homeric hymns, and we got to bring our boy Ovid in here, as we have done throughout the season.
Can't do this without Ovid.
Can't do this without you, Ovid. And Ovid is going to use the Roman names of all of these characters, but for the purposes of our show and continuity, we're going to continue to use the Greek names. I'm also going to say mostly because we hate Persephone's Roman name.
Oh,
and it's difficult to say, and it just feels unusual.
Proserpina.
I can't.
Proserpina.
Okay, so in Ovid's tale, this is where Aphrodite is the one who initiates all of the action. And so here it changes the dynamic from Hades being the aggressor and perhaps rapist of Persephone, and it turns him into one of Aphrodite's victims as well.
Ovid writes, why should Tartarus elude our laws, from the voice of Aphrodite? So she's saying to her son Cupid, why should the underworld be free of our reach?
And don't you see that people are going to start to disrespect us, right? This is something we need to do as like a grasp for power. And so Aphrodite has Cupid opening his quiver. He respects his mother. For him, from his 1,000 shafts, selects the sharpest, surest shaft.
1,000 shafts, the sharpest, surest shaft.
Okay, you better cool it with the wiener references. We are almost escaping this, but a very phallic, obviously. The arrow most responsive to the pressure of his bow. Across his knee, the pliant bow is bent. Love's hooked barb pierces Hades.
His hooked barb? What is this? Some like feeling?
Okay. But what's interesting is this sets in motion the chain of events that we have previously summarized, where Hades is also a victim to this plot and an unwilling participant himself. So here we have that idea that hurt people, right? And he gets pierced by Cupid's arrow, and much like Narcissus, and Echo is doomed to some type of tragic fate because of it.
I was going to say something that I really like about Ovid's telling is that we don't just get the sense that the violence against Persephone only affects Persephone, right? So the story starts out with Persephone frolicking in community with her sister friends, which is how every one of these rapey myths starts out, is like some young, chaste, virginal girl just picking flowers and chilling and getting violated by some like older god who literally can't control himself in some way, shape, or form. Gross. But there's like a part, after Persephone is terrified and being dragged down to the underworld in Hades' chariot by his horses. Part of the geography of the descent is going through all these pools and these springs and pools that flowed through. And there is a water nymph who lives in one of these pools.
And her name?
Cyan.
Which gives us our word for the color blue. I love language. I'm taking you all along this freaking language journey with me.
I think it's so interesting.
I think it's beautiful.
So she literally says to Hades, who is Pluto in this scenario, you cannot pass. You cannot be the son-in-law of Demeter unless she gives her consent. To ask is not to rape. And so, obviously, he keeps going. She calls him the fuck out, and he's like, meh, and like keeps going down towards the underworld.
And she says, like, I was wooed by a dude too, and quote, he never used the terror you abuse. Like, Ovid is very clear in calling out how Hades' behavior is impacting Persephone, regardless of whether Hades is doing it intentionally or not. And I love that. Thank you, Ovid.
I love the double solidarity we see between women here. So Cyan is not only saying like, hey, Persephone, I see you. Like, I was once wooed by some guy I did, whatever. But also, the violation of Persephone is also the violation of Cyan. The next paragraph shows this nymph devolving into a pool. Like, she loses her cognizance almost and her autonomy and just becomes clear water. Her veins are weakened. There is nothing left that one can grasp. So she's no longer a specific entity outside of the water moving around in this pool. And I think it shows like
the loss of personhood and violence, and it affects the whole community, right? There's not just one victim. And what is so tragic about Cyan, I love the way that Ovid phrases this, my translation, Mandelbaum's translation, but Cyan nursed an inconsolable, a silent wound that was incurable, a sadness for the rape of Demeter's daughter and for the violation of the waters of her own pool.
I also think it's a really poignant example of how fucking hard it is to stand up sometimes, particularly as women, and particularly in scenarios like against Hades or Harvey Weinstein or...
And nymphs are traditionally characters in Greek mythology who don't hold a lot of power on their own. Right. They see things, they hear things, they say things, but like our girl Echo, she was punished also for trying to save her friend from rape.
There's like an inherent, I don't like the way that I'm phrasing, but it's true. There's an inherent danger in standing up for each other.
Within the context of the patriarchy, absolutely. There's danger in speaking up. There's danger in women building community. And look at what's happening in Afghanistan right now, that women aren't allowed in public and they're not allowed to go to school or see women doctors or have any conversation with another woman because there is power and solidarity in community.
We often feel like braver when we're not just standing up for ourselves, right? And the patriarchy sees, like Randall's talked about before, and having people talk about their wages, the patriarchy loses its ability to oppress, because once people are in community, Once people are bound to one another or understand their mutualism in relationship, that's really dangerous for a society that's dependent on oppression via individualism, which I think our society is very patriarchal, very capitalistic, and it's very dependent upon the disempowerment of community.
Mm-hmm. And I really like the perspective that women can create life and men cannot. And that's why we're stuck in these power structures, because men will never have the ability to create life in the same way. And so they're grasping for power anywhere else they can find it.
Yet I also think this is a really beautiful example of female power. We stand together and we can say fuck you to the patriarchy. Like, you are doing something the fuck wrong. And I love the idea of these women know they're powerless in a certain extent against the patriarchy. And like, Cyan doesn't give a shit. What she has to say, standing up for Persephone, is more important.
Even to her own detriment. And I feel like there's some power in her transformation into water. In Cyan transforming herself into water, the way that Ovid says there's nothing left that one can grasp, she makes sure she's never turned into a victim in the same way as Persephone again. And there's power and beauty in that transformation and autonomy.
I love that. Oh, I just got chills. I love that correlation between nothing that can be grasped and Hades forcefully grasping Persephone and dragging her down, right? Something that is really interesting about Ovid's version is that in this particular pomegranate story, you have Persephone wandering through a well-kept garden within the underworld. And from a bent branch, she plucks a pomegranate and she peels away its rind and eats 7 seeds. And she's not given this pomegranate. It's just an act of her own volition that she takes and eats this pomegranate. She is seen, however, by some dude. Ascalaphus? Doesn't matter. I don't give a shit. This guy, he sees her eat the seeds. He saw her taste those seeds, denouncing her. He thwarted her return to Earth. So basically, she eats this pomegranate of her own volition. She's seen by somebody who tattletales on her. The act of him telling somebody is what bars her from being able to return to Earth. And so Persephone turns him into a screech owl. I don't know. It's so interesting that this is the one place that Ovid gives her autonomy. Like, she's mad, so she turns this guy into an owl. Like,
I know. I love the way he phrases it too. He was made a bird of evil omen. On his head, she poured waters of Phlegethon. Enormous eyes and beak and feathers are now his. Deprived of what he was, he now wears tawny wings. His head is swollen, and his nails grow long and hook back, forming claws. And it is hard for him to move the feathers that now spout upon his sluggish arms. He has become the bird that men detest, that would announce calamities. He is the lazy screech owl, bringer of bitter auguries to mortals. Oh, fuck me.
It's so weird. Also interesting. Just interesting.
And it's basically saying that the sirens have birds' feathers and birds' feet, but they're skilled in song. And screech owl is not.
You, sirens skilled in song, have been among the bands of friends who joined Persephone when she was gathering spring flowers.
Mm-hmm.
That's what. So they're also. Why are women are being punished left and right for not like doing anything but like loving on each other?
Yeah, they're saying like if it's a punishment for a dude to turn into a bird, then the sirens must all be punished. I mean, that's some Christian shit, man.
That is some Christian shit, man. Such Christian shit. Tit for tat.
Yep, for tat. Just like Caitlin said, Hades isn't the personification of death in Greek mythology. He's the ruler of the underworld. And like we discussed in our episode with Zeus, we have Zeus ruling on Mount Olympus, Poseidon ruling in the ocean and the earth realm, and Hades ruling the underworld down below. And you could just say it was the luck of the draw, right? There were 3 brothers, 3 positions for them to take. This holy trinity of Greek mythology of above, earthbound, and below. And so Hades is just the one who rules over that realm. Mm-hmm. And Thanatos works for Hades, and he works together with the fates, essentially. Once the fates say this person's time on earth their allotted time on earth is up, then Thanatos goes out and he delivers the death, and then Hades rules over the realm of the souls of the shades of the people who have already died. Right. And so in Greek mythology, the souls of those mortals who have already passed on are typically referred to as shades once they're like in the realm of Hades. And oftentimes they're so far removed from their mortal selves that they no longer have attachment to the mortal world or remember who they are or remember their name. And I just saw a great play like a week ago called Hades Town, and they approach this concept when Eurydice gets down to Hades Town, way down under the ground. When she gets to Hades Town, she like tries to make friends with the people who are there. She gets a job, much like in Chaos, she gets a job and she's like trying to make friends with the people who are there working with her. And it's essentially like a chain gang situation, and nobody makes eye contact with her and nobody engages with her. And she's like, what the heck is going on? And Hermes is like, oh, honey girl, these folks don't remember who they are. And don't worry, it'll fade for you too. You've already forgotten your name, haven't you? And like, it's this moment of realization when Eurydice is down there and she starts losing her individuality. And that's definitely something that we could find like textual evidence for in Greek mythology. In Hades Town, one of the songs that Orpheus sings, he refers to him as King of Shadows, King of Shades. Hades was king of the underworld. And in Hades Town, when Eurydice makes her way to the underworld, she is also forced to work. They present it as more, slight spoiler for Hades Town, they present it as more of like a deal with the devil, where Eurydice is hungry and impoverished, and Hades promises her a bountiful life in the underworld. And she chooses to descend. In Hades Town, they portray Hades as being a bad dude, and they portray Persephone as being bound to his whims. And part of the reason why Eurydice and Orpheus are starving and everybody is starving is because Hades isn't honoring the original contract, and he comes up to get Persephone before it's time, and there's not enough time for the food to grow. That's so cool. Interesting. It's pretty interesting because they, instead of the river Styx, they have a train that's a train to the underworld. It's like so good. Once upon a time, there was a railroad line. It was the road to hell. It was hard times. It was a world of gods and men. And so they personify this journey as a railroad ride, and you get to the underworld, and Hades is this like big bad Hexus kind of demon. He has a really low bass voice. And in the version I saw, Persephone was played by a Black woman and Hades was played by a white man. And the tension of that imagery and ownership and enslavement was front and center. And that's not the casting in every single version of Hades Town, but it was a very powerful thing for me to witness. And it brought up how the original myth is for me, right? Like we've discussed so many times, you can't say no if the power structure is so imbalanced. And that was true during times of chattel-based racial enslavement in the US, right? Where the plantation owners had mistresses. They weren't mistresses, they were victims too, right? Just like Persephone is in this story. And in Hades Town, they associated Hades with diesel and like coal production and like mining the abuse of fossil fuels out of the earth in order to like run his railroad and to build his wall. And they have a whole song about building a wall and what it does. And it was a really powerful portrayal of the relationship between Hades and Persephone for me. Great. Well, thank you for taking this journey with me. I know you don't look well. Let's get off.
I'm like miserable. I love you. I love taking journeys with you.
This is great. This journey was fabulous.
Let's always take journeys together.
Yeah, let's do it. Taking a journey to the underworld is always something that cleanses my soul. So I appreciate
it's also always better with a friend
descending with me. Right? Yes. A friend who won't let go of your hand when you stumble.
I will not. But I promise I won't turn around and look at you either. I trust that you're there. At me.
I don't like being perceived. Ready to go? Are we good?
Yep.
Oh, Okay. Love you.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall, Ulyate, and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry, with music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California.